So good day, everyone. My name is Rob Fotland, and I work in the University of Washington as a research computing director. And I'm also the part of the education outreach and training team for the Cloud Bank project, an NSF-sponsored program to provide access to cloud computing tools and resources for academia, primarily in the US. And this is another in our series of cloud clinics titled Using Programmatic AWS-AI for Scientific Research. We generally try and maintain a cloud agnostic stance. There's great things to recommend all the cloud providers. However, sometimes you have to kind of dig into a particular cloud to make a point. So we'll be using AWS today in this presentation. And the topic involves AI. So this is probably a topic that's on everybody's mind these days as the technology is rapidly advancing and enabling us to do a lot of stuff. So this is particularly AI sort of with respect to doing research. And I have sort of three contexts for that. So one of them is the Amazon Web Services Bedrock service. So anything you pay money for on the cloud is a service, and Bedrock is the foundation model access or API service, and so we'll be using that. Then I'm going to mention the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence, ASTA Labs. Those are research tools that are made available by the AI2 nonprofit. And then I'm also going to be talking about using an integrated development environment, which is a version of VS Code called Kiro that's also published by AWS. And all the stuff that's in this presentation is available on GitHub. My username is Rob Fotland, all one word, and then there's the repository is called Mimetes, which is just a Greek word that means imitator or somebody who's imitating. And I'm kind of using that repo to imitate doing research. So without further ado, let's get rolling here. I have some people to admit. So hopefully that's everybody. Okay, great. So off we go. This litany here of bullet points are previous topics that we have touched on in the Cloud Bank Cloud Clinic series. And I'm not going to read through them and belabor them, but I would say that looking at this list, I was trying to come up with a theme for what it's all about. And it really is kind of, if you think about the cloud as being a baseline, cloud computing, so access to a virtual machine and networking and storage space. If that's sort of the substrate or the baseline, and then the upper thing, the aspirational thing in research is maybe a series of milestone publications or conversations at conferences. That's the sort of the sciencey end of what we do. Then these cloud clinics are something of sort of a connective tissue between the two. So it's talking about services that are available and practices that you can adopt in doing research. So we're trying to facilitate you being more productive and successful in your research by offering these cloud clinics. So I mentioned the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence. That's abbreviated AI2, and they have a research toolbox that I'll refer to as ASTA. So that'll come up later. Today's theme, I'd like to imagine that we are glaciologists and we're interested in glacier thickness and surface velocity in Alaska. That's just to have a definite topic to go and pursue. And we have access to the AWS or Amazon Web Services cloud, and therefore to the AWS Bedrock Foundation Model Service. This service can route our AI prompts to the Anthropic Claude large language model. So we hope this is going to be a helpful research tool. To continue, also, suppose that we use the Kiro integrated development environment that I mentioned, which is based on VS Code, Visual Studio Code, and it includes a built-in AI coding assistant. I'm just going to check the chat for a moment. Okay. So that's the Kiro IDE. And then finally, I mentioned AI2 offers these artificial intelligence powered research services. So we have these three different modes that we're operating in. So the plan of action is we're going to go and use the Semantic Scholar that's at AI2, and that has an API. So we're going to locate a paper that's going to be the sort of the starting point for this little sequence of events. Then we're going to download the paper and extract the text and figures and summarize it, and then identify whether or not that paper points to some related code, a code base, and whether it points to some related data. And then we're going to use the Kiro IDE to generate some charts. And then we're going to ask a research question of Claude Sonnet. And then we're going to jump into the Asta toolbox and look at something called auto discovery. And then we'll make a comment on how much this costs in terms of using AI with prompts and tokens and all that kind of stuff. And then I'll mention making everything here open and public. If you want to dig into the sort of the scientific aspect of my narration here, since I'm going to try and go pretty quickly, you can just download or clone the repo and look at everything in more detail. And then I'll make a final comment on the use of the Kiro IDE. So that's my plan. And I think I can just roll down here. And so everything that's coming in this narrative is sort of originating from my laptop. So I'm just assuming I'm running Kiro on my laptop, I'm not using cloud machines or anything like that. And we suppose that we know about the NASA Ice Bridge mission, which was a ice penetrating radar that measured the thicknesses of glaciers in Alaska. So we're going to ask the AI2 Semantic Scholar. So AI2 is the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence, and they have a service called Semantic Scholar, which is like Google Scholar, but it tries to operate in a connective, associative way to find interesting and relevant references. And so I took the Kiro IDE and said, okay, write me some code, some Python code to go and talk to the Semantic Scholar REST API. And what's very gratifying about that is that the Kiro IDE can just go to a website, figure out the API, and write code to talk to that particular service. That's what's in this code box here. And as a result of this, with sufficient query search terms, we managed to come up with the result of the Tober et al. Alaskan Glacier Dynamics from a Decade of Airborne Radar Sounding paper, which included a DOI, so that's important. And it also pointed out that from the search process, that this paper is available on something called Earth Archive, which is a geoscience-oriented version of the archive preprint repository. So an aside on the digital object identifier, probably everybody's familiar with that, but the point is that from my laptop going to Semantic Scholar and getting a DOI, I was able to then take that over to the doi.org sort of index, find out where that paper is, and get a PDF download link. So this is all kind of an automated flow that's enabled by having the digital object identifier, the DOI. Semantic Scholar is, as I mentioned, and Kiro is kind of the coding engine that's doing all this stuff, including writing the findpaper.py Python file. So that's 8 lines of Python code to get this information. Now we're on step 2. We're going to download the paper, the PDF, and from that PDF, we need to actually get the text of the paper in order to send that to Claude Sonnet and get a summary of the paper. And so in order to do that, the Kiro IDE says to me, you will need to install PyMute PDF. So you will need to install X is a common theme in working with the IDEs that want to go off and do things on our behalf on the web. So again, we have these sort of 3 lines of code, and this turns the 43-page paper into this block of text, which we can then send to Claude Sonnet for a summary of the paper that we're interested in. And we also managed to pull a couple of figures out of this paper. This happens to be a glacier in Alaska, and what we're looking at here is the bottom of the glacier, what the elevation is, and everything in that sort of lower left quadrant that's sort of brightly colored, that's all stuff that's below sea level. So you could say this is the bed elevation of an existing glacier, or you could also say this is a future fjord once all this pesky ice melts away. This would be the fjord that you could sail up because this is all below sea level. So we pulled a couple of figures out of the paper. This is the ice thickness. This is how thick the ice is. And that's also interesting glaciology. So we have those two papers pulled, but we also, now we have the text of the paper, send that to AWS Bedrock to summarize the paper. So now we have yet another API call to the AWS Bedrock API. And this is some of the key code, and you'll notice the first line of code says import Boto 3. So Boto 3 is a Python library that enables a Python program to talk to the AWS cloud. And there's some authentication some authentication keys that are involved, and I'm not going to go into that. But the main point is that this is sort of the tip of the iceberg of the code. And what I'd like to do is take a moment to actually go and look at the Kiro IDE that I keep referring to and the code for this summary.py program. So I will hop out of full screen mode and bring up the Kiro IDE. And there's a chat window over here on the right-hand side. I'll make that go away. So we're just looking at the code. And what I think is interesting is that this block of green text here, and maybe I can make this a little bit bigger. This block of green text looks like comments in Python code. It doesn't really look like Python, but it's actually a big, huge string, the prompt string that's going to be sent to Claude Sonnet through the Amazon Web Services Bedrock Foundation Model Service. So that's why it says you're a scientific research assistant and so forth. So it gives all these instructions, including asking Claude Sonnet, are there any resources for code or data associated with this paper that I'm sending you? So we've taken the PDF of the paper, broken it down into text. We're getting ready to send that text, and here's where that text gets included in this prompt. And this entire thing is going to be sent to Claude Sonnet, and then we're going to get the response back. All right, so let me see if I can get back to my my presentation here. Okay, so the summary goes out, or the request goes out, the summary comes back. These are some of the bullets from the summary that's provided by Claude Sonnet, and this is all great stuff. And it also answers this question, does the paper reference code or data repositories? And it says, yeah, there's this RAGU radar analysis code available from GitHub. There's a data that will be available. And there's also a data set sitting on GitHub that's not mentioned here. There is the source data archived at NASA and so forth. I was also interested in ice velocities, but there's no time to go into that. But the project is called It's Live, and I pulled in some ice velocities that correspond to the ice thicknesses that we're getting from the Ice Bridge project. And so step 5 is to take some of this little data set that I managed to pull together. So ice velocities and ice thicknesses and ice elevations, and create a CSV file out of that. And then use the Kiro IDE to write some Python code to generate a chart. So now we're looking at two pieces of information overlaid on top of each other. That's why there's two y-axes. So the light blue shading is glacier. This is upstream from where we were looking before, but it's the same glacier system, and it's the ice thickness and the ice surface. So the ice is flowing downhill from the right side of the figure to the left side of the figure. And then the trace that goes along, it's kind of jagged trace in red, is the surface speed. And that's data from a different project, the It's Live project. And it's simply showing that as you go downhill on this glacier, you come to an area where the speed ramps up. And so that's interesting And if you're not familiar, glacier ice tends to flow downhill due to two types of motion. The first is the deformation under its own weight. So it's like very thick motor oil that's kind of sliding downhill. And then the bottom of the glacier, which is in contact with bedrock, not the same bedrock as the AWS service. That bottom of the glacier is also capable of sliding along the glacier. So you have sliding motion and deformation motion. And all this is observed data, but if I take the characteristics of the ice and calculate the deformation, I'll find that it's not enough to account for the total speed that we see in this jagged red plot. And so there must be some sliding going on. And I mention this just to sort of motivate a scientific research question that we will then use or present to Claude Sonnet and ask it for its insight on what's going on here. So let me take a moment. Three. Okay. So now now that I've done a little bit of waving my arms about the glaciology, we'll take the next step forward in our sequence of 10 here, which is to pose a related research question to Claude Sonnet. So we have this sort of 1 degree surface slope, very gradual glacier that's somewhere between 600 and 1,200 meters thick. And the deformation speed is something like 15 to 100 meters per year, but the observed speed is 140 to 220 meters per year, which means that the observation is faster than the glacier would move if it was just deforming under its own weight, and therefore there must be some basal sliding going on, some sliding along the bedrock. And the question is, are there estimates in the literature for sliding speed relevant to these estimates that we have from this data, both in magnitude and variability? So we go back to the Kiro IDE, generate some Python code, sends the prompt to Bedrock, passes that along to Sonnet, and we get an answer back called Bedrock response dot markdown. Kind of a pun, I guess. So now I'm going to go back and take a look at the Bedrock response document that was provided by Claude Sonnet. Again, this is using code, programmatically sending a scientific query to a large language model and seeing what's coming back. So we will go back to the Kiro IDE and we will take a look at the Bedrock response. So this is what came back in response to that scientific question. And it starts off with section 1, citing various literature, even something that I wrote. That's kind of amusing. So we have this literature context for sliding speeds and variability in velocity on a glacier. Okay, so it's done a good job with that. It sort of casts a wider net and starts talking about glaciers that aren't in Alaska. Well, very good it is, but and then it goes into the physical mechanism for the sliding speed range, and it does a pretty reasonable job of going through this set of ideas. And then because I capped the number of tokens it would be able to send me back, it stops on section 3 with specific papers and data sets. So, at least at a glance, this is a perfectly reasonable set of ideas and references that came back in response to this query. So that's step 6, and now we can move on to step 7. Let me see here. What am I looking for? I'm looking for that and that. Okay. So our narrative now takes us back to the AI2, the Allen Institute, ASTA auto discovery experiments. And this is something I'm going to describe, and it's kind of what happens when an entire group of people over at AI2 say, well, let's explore this agentic AI and sort of see if we can create a system that's capable of ingesting a data set. And that data set I showed earlier in the CSV file, the sort of compressed text. And so the idea is that I'm going to upload that data set to ASTA, to the auto discovery service. And I'm going to provide context for that data. I'm going to say this is glaciology data, it's ice thickness, and plus the surface speeds, where it's located, all that kind of stuff. And then I'm going to say to it, I want you to do 10 experiments on this data where you go off and think about things that you could do, analysis of the data, and then come back and give me reports on those experiments. And I have a capacity for so many credits. Now, the data set is so small that there's not really a lot you can do with it. But nevertheless, it makes a good toy example. So I went to auto discovery and did the upload and did the description and so forth. And then the sequence of slides that I have kind of is trying to describe what happens. And I'll also take a moment to go over and actually look at a web browser that's logged into the Asta auto discovery so you can sort of see the whole effect of how it's all put together. Okay, so here is the create a new discovery session. So we're going to upload the data set, the Bagley longitudinal study data, and we're going to describe what the different columns in that CSV file are all about, what the domain of the data set is, and so forth. So that's the configuration of Asta Auto Discovery to go and do some experiments. And then I'm skipping the experiments, and then I'm coming back to what shows up at the end. And one of the things that shows up is this little graph, and you'll notice that there's a central node that doesn't have a number. That's sort of like where we start from, and then the little nodes with numbers are different experiments and this analysis that Asta Auto Discovery comes up with. And it actually thinks about it, so to speak, writes some code, and runs the code and analyzes the data and then comes up with a conclusion. And if the conclusion is what it expected, then it's not very surprised and it says, oh, it's no big deal. But if the conclusion is different than what it expected, then it's, oh, I'm very surprised, and it sort of flags that as interesting. So we have this little graph, and you can see that one experiment, like experiment number 6, was slightly surprising. It's bright colored, and therefore it led to a couple more experiments. And so this is the sort of hypothesis statement that Asta Auto Discovery gives you, and then it gives the analysis in this write-up. And it also provides the code so that you can grab that code and run the same analysis on the data yourself. And this particular experiment that I'm digging into, let's see if I'm not, we'll see it, I think, in the other thing. The experiment number 6, it tried to do an analysis of the data, and you can see that the data is scattered all over the place. So it's not very conclusive. So it's not like making, wild promises of everything that I do is going to be wonderful. It goes and tries a bunch of stuff, and sometimes it doesn't find anything terribly interesting. So that's that. And that's a sort of screen capture version of what auto discovery is doing. And I'll go and open up the, oops, come on. Yeah, go open up the auto discovery. Okay, so this is so a quick tour of the Asta Labs facility. This is kind of the front door, which has these different tools for finding papers and generating a report, analyzing some data. But then when we get into, oh, sorry, this is an example of a literature search with a bunch of relevant papers. But now here's the auto discovery, Asta Labs auto discovery. And here's where I've uploaded that data set and given some context and then started it off on the path of doing this analysis. And we have experiment ID 6. So let's see, here's the 10 experiments that it decided to do on my data set. Hopefully you can see that scrolling up and down. And each one has its own hypothesis and a surprise score, and then sort of the before and after belief of what it thinks about the hypothesis that it came up with. And then over here on the right-hand panel, we have the hypothesis analysis for a particular one of those 10 experiments, including the steps that it took, the code, as I mentioned, and the output of the code, and the chart that it comes up with, and then sort of a final write-up. So this is an interesting and openly available sort of utility. The future of this, because these experiments being run on the cloud somewhere aren't free, it'll probably morph into something that you can download and run on your own laptop or some other environment where you have to have the keys to access the language models and so forth in order to pay for it as you go. So that's the quick introduction to Asta Labs Auto Discovery that I wanted to include in this presentation. And now I'll go back to, oops. I will go back to my proper presentation as such. And so hopefully this has kind of given a flavor for using a local IDE that's got a coding assistant. I used Kiro to connect to resources out there. For example, the AWS large language model interface through Bedrock, or in the case that I just finished showing, the Asta Labs auto discovery. And the kind of integration and the multimodal nature of the AI tools that we have is, for me, is sort of confusing and hard to keep up with, but it's also potentially really powerful and useful. So it's a very interesting process to be in. So the last three steps I have now follow, and they're pretty quick. Step 8 is cost accounting. The tokens count for the summary that we did, including asking about, is there code associated, is there data associated, and so forth. The total amount came in at 30 cents, so it's not dreadful. The MyMatees repository under my Rob Fotland GitHub organization or my username has all the kind of stuff that I've been describing in this brief talk. So there's that, and it's sort of part of our encouraging open and reproducible results to mention as often as we conveniently can that starting with GitHub and being careful with what you do and don't put in your GitHub repository, but providing this stuff so that other people can participate in what you've got going on is a great option to be able to have. And then lastly, a final comment on building with the Kiro IDE. I think I've kind of already made this point, but this interactivity with Kiro allowed me to build this case study for this presentation, including the slide deck. And so the interactivity with Kiro is a pretty interesting and powerful development. There's something called a steering file. So because I do multiple projects using Kiro, I sort of get in the habit of putting these guidelines in the steering file. And those help to keep the coding assistant behaving in a way that's constructive. For example, remind me to try and keep my disk space clear. And when we discuss something technical, place that into a documentation file. And then, of course, as we've seen, Kiro can unilaterally adopt to API interfaces or MCP servers. So in its own sort of self-aggrandizing words, it describes itself as the tool to build tool to support the science. So that's that. So here's a little summary table of the kind of stuff that's been built into this talk and what it was and how it got done. Here's an acknowledgement for the Asta toolbox, including, it mentions Data Voyager, but actually auto discovery is the main thing that we used. And that's everything I think I got to say.